Hi everybody, welcome to your third video for this class, but this is actually the fourth week. And so the focus of this week is about language, community, and identity. You have several different things to view and or read, and so I'm just going to talk through some of the big ideas to get you started on what you are going to be focusing on this week. So let's just start with talking about the video that you watched. It's a quick TED Talk from Jamila Lyscott, and it's called 3 Ways to Speak English. I'm hoping you really enjoyed this piece. I chose it for a lot of reasons. First, I want to make sure that I'm being really clear and overt with you about the way that I view language and the way that I approach language in this class. Just based on seeing your faces and hearing what you have to say so far from our flip grids, I can see that we come from a lot of different backgrounds in this class, and it's awesome. It's great to have people from different backgrounds, different life experiences, and so with that comes a flexibility on my part as I view language. So instead of, as I think I said on one of our first lives, our Zoom lives, I'm not trying to make you into mini me's where you speak and think and act just like me. I want you to be yourself, but just a more critical version as you think about language and communication. And so in this TED Talk, she talks about 3 different ways to speak English and the fact that she's actually a tri-tongued orator, in that she has 3 Englishes that she uses: the English with her friends, the English in the classroom, and then the English with her parents. Totally different, but yet all equally valid forms of English. And so what many of you have been taught thus far is white mainstream English as the way to speak, the way to communicate, if you want to be successful in the world, yada, yada, yada. And the problem with that is that it is steeped in anti-Black racism. So that is not what I am going to forward in this class. You're not going to see that in the assignments that I have given you or in my grading practices or any of those things. So I believe that there are lots of different kinds of ways of communication and a lot of different kinds of Englishes. And I think you probably saw that from your reading this week between Gloria Anzaldua's work and then Jamila Lyscott's work. So one of the main points that Lyscott makes in her TED Talk is that language is constantly changing. It doesn't remain stagnant. The English that we speak now is very remarkably different from the English that was spoken even 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And as she points out in her TED Talk, the most, quote, articulate speakers of English in the United States would be viewed as foolish to the British. So here's some other big points. Black language has rules and structure. They're just different from white mainstream English, but that doesn't mean that Black language is less than or inferior. It's one of her main points, and it's actually a huge change, I would say, over the last 10 to 20 years in the field of rhetoric and writing. But still, it's a slow process, because even this field, even these teachers like me who are teaching composition have been taught one way. And so we need to unlearn those practices, and that's what I'm forwarding on to you. So how do we judge people based on their use of language? She brings up some really great points, and we will unintentionally or intentionally judge people based on their use of language. Do they use improper English? How good are they with their grammar and mechanics? Those are things that we can work on little by little, but there's no room for judgment for that kind of behavior, in my opinion. So she makes some pretty tough claims towards the end that are true but difficult to hear, that Black language has a violent history towards Black Americans. And those are things we need to take into account the way we approach language. So that is the TED Talk. And then moving on to Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands. That's a whole book. I'm just having you read one chapter, chapter 5. And so we have a different perspective here. Now we have a perspective from a self-identified Chicanx. And so if you're not familiar with that term, with the X at the end of it, so Chicano is typically used to identify individuals who are Mexican American, but more recently the term Chicanx or Latinx have been forwarded as a way of being inclusive to all gender identities. So she talks a lot about discrimination towards Latinx, Chicanx individuals in school settings, and then the push to speak English only, like in an abusive way. And I'm guessing probably some of you have experienced something like that too in your education in the United States. She talks about language being a male discourse, and her example is the word nosotros, which, along with many Spanish words, are based in the male gender. So she pushes back against that a little bit. In reference to Chicano Spanish, which she talks about quite a bit, she says, Chicano Spanish sprung out of the Chicanos' need to identify themselves as distinct people. We need a language with which we could communicate with ourselves, a secret language. So, and she also lists 8 different dialects of Chicano Spanish. So again, I'm hoping that you're seeing the similar thread of language evolving, a lot of different iterations of it, not one way of speaking English. So she also talks about the idea of a home tongue, a language spoken with family, and then talks about Anglicanisms, or words distorted by English, and Pachuco, a language of rebellion against standard English or standard Spanish. So this pushing back against there's one way of speaking and kind of messing things up to be rebellious. She talks about how Chicano Spanish has continued to change throughout the years and is different from other forms of Spanish spoken throughout the world, and even talks about different dialects that are in Texas alone. So it's really interesting to hear, especially from an outsider. I am a white woman. I do not have any background. I am not even from Texas, and I am not Latinx. I do not identify in those ways. So for me, it was really instructional. And it may be instructional for many of you. And then for others, it's going to be like, yeah, I knew that all along. So please don't view this as me trying to educate you on something you already know. Rather, my purpose in talking about these concepts is to push back on the idea of one English, one language, one right way of doing things in terms of how we communicate. Anzaldúa talks about this idea of linguistic terrorism. And what she means by that is that trying to take over and be abusive about language and force people to speak your version of it. So she says that Chicano Spanish is often viewed as poorly speaking the language rather than viewing its history with pride. So one of her big points is to say, hey, that's not right. And that ethnic identity is very much linked with linguistic identity. So if you're going to mess with someone's linguistic identity, you're in turn messing with their ethnic identity. One really great thing that she says is, I will no longer be made to feel ashamed of existing. I will have my voice, Indian, Spanish, white. I will have my serpent's tongue, my woman's voice, my sexual voice, my poet's voice. I will overcome the tradition of silence. So you can see this is an act of empowerment as she is communicating about language and identity. So these are the big picture items that are being discussed this week in the readings, and your discussions and everything that are going to come from these readings and viewings are meant to allow you the opportunity to think about what your perspective of language is and what your perspective of white mainstream English is, or Black language, or Chicano Spanish, and about all of the different varieties of speaking and communicating and listening that we have in our country. And that's a good thing. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your responses, and I'm really enjoying getting to know you better as well. So I hope you have a great week. Thanks.